Hi, I'm Harpreet Singh. I'm the director of the Division of Oncology 2 at the FDA's Office of Oncologic Diseases within CEDAR. I am also a geriatrician by training, so really excited to be here to discuss an FDA and OCE perspective on safety reporting, and I hope that some of this background information engenders a greater discussion around SAEs in older adults with serious illness. I'm joined today by Dr. Shaylee Arora and Dr. Abby Nair, both of whom are Associate Directors for Safety within the Oncology Office and certainly quite well versed in this subject matter as well. So I'm grateful to them for joining this conversation. I have no disclosures. So I would like to start out today by giving you some regulatory definitions, because I know there are many definitions out there of various safety reporting requirements, and I want to just get to the basics of what is rooted in the Code of Federal Regulations. So we'll start with some of that. I also want to really highlight the distinctions between what is a serious adverse event versus what is a serious unexpected adverse reaction. And there's a key distinction there. You may have heard these referred to as SUSARs in the past, and we actually don't use this term SUSAR in FDA guidance, but certainly refer to these serious unexpected reactions, adverse reactions. I also want to get into a little bit around collecting data, collection versus reporting, and also the concept of the role of the IRB versus the FDA. What needs to be reported to the IRB versus what needs to be reported in an expedited fashion to the FDA. I would like to discuss some of the OCE's initiatives around over-reporting from industry sponsors, which has been identified several years ago as a persistent issue. And finally, discuss a few examples of regulatory flexibility in terms of palliative endpoints. So if you go to FDA's guidances website or just Google, you'll find that there are several guidances for industry and investigators around safety reporting requirements for INDs. And I want to highlight that in 2010, the FDA issued final rule amending its regulations which governed expedited IND safety reportings and revised definitions used for reporting and really tried to clarify when to submit relevant and importantly useful information. And the goal of this was to really reduce the number of uninformative reports distributed by sponsors, and we'll talk a little bit later about whether or not that was effective. So certainly the evaluation of safety is a process that evolves. Data that is available is stage dependent, so you would know a lot more about a drug in a randomized registrational intent trial compared to a first-in-human study that's dose finding, for example. We include safety information on approved products, and mostly I'm talking about drug products in the product labeling, and certainly we expect that up-to-date safety information is provided in the investigator's brochure. So safety monitoring takes many forms. When we talk about adverse events, certainly the distinction between unexpected versus common, serious adverse events, laboratory abnormalities, and we'll get a little bit more into some of these definitions very shortly. Okay. So an unanticipated adverse event I thought was worth highlighting because this is something that is required based on FDA guidance to be submitted to an IRB, to the IRB. And unanticipated AEs have to meet several criteria. They need to be serious, unexpected, and uncommon, such that, and strongly associated with drug exposure. So this would be something like angioedema or Stevens-Johnson's. Similarly, you could have a small number of occurrences that occur of an unexpected event that's not typically associated with drug exposure. and also is uncommon in the study population, like tendon rupture that we see in one of our more commonly used antibiotics. Also, if you have multiple occurrences of an AE that, based on an aggregate analysis, is determined to be an unanticipated problem. So this should be a determination by the investigator that these series of AEs actually represent a signal and that the AEs were not just isolated occurrences. Also, I want to point out that any AEs which are addressed within the investigator's brochure or consent or protocol, which occur at a specificity or a severity that's inconsistent, or certainly at a rate, a frequency that's higher than what is expected, those should also be reported to the IRB by the investigator. Okay, what is a suspected adverse reaction? And again, these are all regulatory definitions. A suspected adverse reaction is an adverse event that has a reasonable possibility of drug-related causality. Who determines if that is a reasonable possibility? The investigator. So you have your adverse events, a much bigger collection, and you have your adverse reactions, and suspected adverse reactions are those which have a reasonable possibility of drug-related causality. So the meat of today and the general topic of this group is serious adverse events, how they're reported, how they're defined, and currently this is the regulatory definition of a serious adverse event per the Code of Federal Regulations. So this is an adverse event or suspected adverse reaction is considered serious if, and I think this is important to highlight, if either, not both, but either the investigator or sponsor, in the view of either the investigator or sponsor, it results in any of the following outcomes. So death, a life-threatening adverse event, inpatient hospitalization or prolongation of existing hospitalization, or a persistent or significant incapacity or substantial disruption of the ability to conduct normal life functions. This, I think, is very important, how we evaluate a serious adverse event. So relevant to this conversation today, is this serious adverse event a common occurrence in the population under study? And I think this is worth coming back to in our discussion. Was it treatment emergent? Did it respond to D-challenge? Did it recur on re-challenge? Were there any pertinent labs or tests performed? Was there an obvious alternative cause? Also worth coming back to. And is SAE a study endpoint? Okay, so what has to be reported from the investigator to the sponsor? Again, we're still not talking about reporting to the FDA. From an FDA perspective, this is still in the hands of the investigator and the sponsor. So all serious adverse events with a causality assessment should be reported by the investigator to the sponsor, as well as adverse events and or laboratory abnormalities identified in the protocol as critical to safety evaluations. Now, the idea that serious adverse events are not reviewed by the FDA is actually not quite accurate. We do review serious adverse events in the context of a new drug or a supplemental drug application. However, as depicted here in this slide, they are not required to be submitted in an expeditious fashion. And so we'll describe now what actually needs to be reported in an expedited manner by the sponsor to the FDA. And that is, again, what we have classically and typically here described as SUSARs. Again, we don't use that term in FDA guidance, but they are adverse events that meet all three criteria. They are serious, they are unexpected, and suspected adverse reactions, all of which we've defined. If they are fatal or life-threatening, they should be reported to the FDA within 7 days and everything else within 15 days. So I just want to highlight that again, that unless the adverse event meets all three criteria, it actually should not be submitted to the FDA by the sponsor as part of the IND safety report. So the majority of expedited IND safety reports are uninformative. This was the title of a publication in CCR in 2016 by several FDA authors, including Meredith Chuck. What the group did was look at mean number of safety reports per IND by year as depicted in the figure, looking at an 8-year period from 2006 to 2014. And certainly the concept of the final rule was that we would see these decrease. We did not see that. In fact, we saw that after 2010, the mean number of IND safety reports actually increased. The group did an audit of 160 randomly selected safety reports in the year 2015 and found that only 14% were actually informative. I can tell you, as somebody who was a primary reviewer and had an inbox full of these safety reports, that it really, it adds to workload in a way that's really important because it detracts us from detecting actual valid safety signals and understanding what actually is anticipated. So the FDA oncology group did not stop here at this publication. There were several more. They reached out to several sponsors who were particularly guilty of this practice of over-reporting, sent letters, met with companies individually to review their reporting practices, and asked essentially that they stop. They review how they were reporting safety information, why they were conducting reporting this way, and actually many of them successfully were able to decrease their safety reporting by 50 to 60%. We're still working with other companies as well. This is not a problem that's been completely abolished, but I do think that the action by the oncology group has been of value, and I hope that that can be part of our conversation as well. So I wanted to end with just a discussion of what I think is a good example of regulatory flexibility in an oncology space, where you typically see endpoints like overall survival, progression-free survival, tumor reduction in terms of response rate. But in 2019, the oncology group approved the drug fedratinib for myelofibrosis with the primary endpoint of reduction in spleen volume or splenomegaly, which is quite bothersome for patients with myelofibrosis. And this actually was not the first approval of its kind. There was another drug, ruxolitinib, which was approved several years ago with the actually very same endpoint. So I think what this does demonstrate is that where regulatory flexibility is available to us to utilize, we do. And I think there's really several more examples of that in the oncology space. However, where we do have regulations that we're governed by, there's a degree of flexibility that we can exercise, but we still have to follow the code of federal regulations as it pertains to safety reporting. I do think there is still a good amount of over-reporting, perhaps not over-collection, and I think that's something we can all discuss. Thank you so much for having me, and I do very much look forward to joining you and having Shaylee and Abby join us as well. So thanks again.